Jumping into Unit 4, Assignment 1, we have a lecture video from Professor Gernsbacher titled, How is the Internet Changing the Way We Communicate? The lecture starts with a brief overview of how specifically cell phone usage has exploded in recent times. It talks about how there are Reddit posts where people comment talking about what are the most difficult things to explain about the modern day technology to people from the 1950s. And among the multiple responses, the most upvoted response was that, quote, I possess a device in my pocket that is capable of accessing the entirety of information known to humanity. And then there's another little anecdote about how back in 2005, when thousands of Italians were awaiting the first appearance of the newly installed Pope, there were very few people who were checking their phones, which is kind of crazy to think about because in today's society, a moment like that, you can imagine that many people would be on their phones at a time like that just because it is such a historical moment that it's kind of natural to want to capture it, usually in like video or photo format. But I mean, just back in the day, that wasn't the norm because the technology wasn't really there to do that as compared to today. As technology becomes more common and more useful, there has been a growing concern that the internet is making communication less formal. Examples are given of how the internet is used to convey informal messages. Like, for example, there's talked about Dr. Francis Collins, director of the U.S. National Institute of Health, the largest medical research agency in the world, and he makes a tweet. And at the end of this tweet, he talks about a recent Supreme Court case that has recently gone down. And in the tweet, he says that the U.S. Supreme Court case ruling that a naturally occurring DNA segment is a product of nature and therefore is not patent eligible. And then he ends this tweet with the slang expression woohoo, and there's like three exclamation points after it and everything. And even though this is an example of like an informal message being sent, the reality is that this kind of informality and this briefness is not something that's necessarily new to the internet phase. Another example is given of a historical moment when like informal briefness was used in messaging. An example is shared about the author Victor Hugo. After finishing a novel of his, he goes away on vacation, and then because he's kind of anxious about it and he wants to know how it's selling, he sends his publisher a letter, and then all it has on it is just a single question mark. That's it. And then a week later, he actually gets a message back from his publisher, and it's just a single exclamation point. And that's the whole thing. That's the whole communication. And even though this took place back in 1862, it does kind of spread the idea that informality is something that humans have always kind of been pretty familiar with. It's just that we're more, I guess, critical about it when it's coming from the internet because we like to think that it sort of started this trend of informality that we see with like emojis and abbreviations and just this general shortening of a lot of things during text. But the reality is that this has been around for a very long time. The lecture then goes on to explain that the internet is influencing how we communicate by giving people more of a preference for written messages compared to like text to speech or directly calling people. And one of the main reasons for why this is because written messages can be interacted with asynchronously. So that means that people can kind of write these messages and just leave them. And the people who these messages are being sent to can kind of just receive them whenever they need to. And then it's up to them to just respond whenever is convenient for them. And it's this level of kind of convenience and simplicity that is very attractive for some people. And understandably so. I mean, I text all the time in my own life, and I would agree that, it would be annoying if I had to call people all the time or if I had to like go out of my way to find a time to interact with people outside of just being able to leave them a simple message and then letting them respond to me whenever they're free to respond to me. I then read a series of tweets and articles that all went on to also talk about how different forms of kind of synchronous and asynchronous communication have shifted in recent times. One of them was a tweet that jokingly talked about how if calling was invented today for cell phones as an app, then it would not be popular because people just wouldn't find much use in it. They'd prefer to text. There was also a story about how Michigan State would be banning whiteboards from dormitory doors. The reason for this ban is because inappropriate messages were being written, hateful messages, and the university decided to just take these forms of messaging away. This is an example of a tool that didn't even utilize the internet, but it was still being used to kind of communicate with others asynchronously, but not necessarily for good. And yeah, basically these readings just all kind of focused on the different abilities of asynchronous and synchronous communication and how they relate to internet use or how they predate internet use. But in my discussion post for this assignment, I talked about how the internet is not making communication any briefer or any more formal. I also talked about the difference between transient and intransient communication, with transient communication typically not lasting very long and being more temporary, and how intransient communication, such as written communication, is more long lasting and will kind of exist after it's spoken. Generally, societally, people prefer intransient communication just because it can be referenced back to, and you can use it as kind of a tool to remember what was said. Whereas transient communication kind of disappears once that communication is over. It's up to you to sort of remember it, which means there's kind of a lack of reliability, and it could be just more difficult for everyone involved that way. And then as for the preference of asynchronous over synchronous, it's really just a matter of people being able to communicate with others on their own kind of time and not having to be working with everyone else's timetable, but rather being able to come and go and communicate with others as is convenient. And then also in this discussion post, we were expected to share a time in our own lives or from the readings when we preferred to communicate asynchronously with another person. And I just mentioned how in my own life, I find texting and emailing to be incredibly convenient just because, if I have a question for a professor, for example, it's easy for me to just do that, to just send it out rather than having to figure out their office hours and go find them and sit down with them and ask them this question. Just because it really saves time on travel and it saves time on actual the interaction itself and just all that stuff. It's a lot easier to be able to just send off an email or something and then go on with your day, and then whenever they respond to you, to look at it. But that's everything for Unit 4 Assignment 1, so now it was time to move on to Assignment number 2. Assignment 2 started with a reading called How to Email a Professor. The meaning of this article was pretty self-explanatory. It holds a bunch of tips, about 9, that just kind of are generally good tips about emailing your professors and being formal in your emails in general. It's about things like using your basic university email account and not a personal account, using your professor's last name, writing like a useful subject heading that is actually brief enough to not be cluttered but also representative of your email, and then using good grammar and just things like that. But just basically a set of good reminders about emailing that most people should be familiar with when it comes to conversing with your professor or other professional figures. Another humorous example is given in a tweet that's shared where a professor posts an email they received from a student where the student refers to them as Mr. Whatever, presumably because this was meant to be some kind of a placeholder where they waited to find out the last name of the professor but then forgot to replace it. So the email went out as Mr. Whatever, and it was just uploaded to Twitter as kind of this humorous thing of how you should make sure you're rereading your emails to make sure there's no sort of mistakes left in them. But then after this, we were told to share the How to Email a Professor set of tools or tips with 5 other college students. So I did this. I found 5 of my friends and I sat them down and showed them the list. And then I asked each of these 5 friends of mine to identify the suggestions that they were least familiar and most familiar with. And then I made sure to make a post about it. But responses varied. Some people said they were familiar with similar things as things that I had heard from my other friends, and some friends gave unique answers too. The first person I talked to said they were least familiar with the idea that paragraph breaks should be used inside of emails and not just inside of writings as they had done. And then they said they were most familiar with the idea of addressing the professor based on their last name. They thought that it was kind of strange to ever contact someone based on just a title of prof or their first name. And then I had another friend who talked about how they were not very familiar with the idea of giving an informative subject line for the email. They figured it didn't really matter all that much what the email heading said as long as the content showed what their issue was. And then they said that they were most familiar with the idea of writing emails that possess good grammar. Um, they try to use good grammar all the time, so this didn't surprise me, knowing them. They said that they didn't like getting them because they found them frustrating to read, so they always made sure to send out good emails. And then my other three friends, similarly, they all gave kind of a smattering of answers that reflected how they felt about communication in general. But after I made my post there, that was the end of assignment number 2. Moving on to assignment number 3, I read all of the summaries that the other chat groups had posted for Unit 3, where everyone talked about the 3 challenges that they felt were faced by college students and how they would kind of create like a good online solution to these problems. Starting off, I responded to Group Q because their post that they gave was different from ours for the most part. They talked about the cost of textbooks, the cost of education, and the general challenge of managing mental health in college at the same time. And we talked about cost a little bit too in our post, so they weren't completely different by any means. But this was one of the more unique groups from our own, I thought, just because they also talked about that kind of mental health snippet, and we didn't really look into that too much. I mean, being a college student is about doing your work, but also looking out for yourself, because this might be the first time for many people when they don't have parents around necessarily, or old friends who are kind of familiar with their habits. So it really becomes more important to know yourself and know your limits and know how to work within those boundaries. Next up, I want to comment on Group P's post just because there are 3 topics that they discussed were actually very similar to our own. They talked about how early morning classes were an issue, the rising cost of college, and how traditional lecture models are not as accommodating. This almost actually perfectly mirrored our own talking points. They talked about rising costs of college, and so did we. They talked about how traditional lectures can sometimes not be accommodating. And this was comparable to how we talked about how it can be difficult to learn in like a large lecture space just because the idea is that maybe you're not like as in close of contact with your professor as you might like. But then also them talking about like early morning classes in like being more specific about that. We talked about how bad schedules can be frustrating, but we didn't specifically go into what it's like to work in the morning. So that was kind of cool to see them talk about that. But I made my 2 posts then with my 200 words each on the 2 different posts that were made by other groups. But then after that, I was done with assignment 3. Starting off assignment number 4, we have an article from the professor from 2014 titled Internet-Based Communication. And right away, we're forwarded to the section titled Example Internet-Based Communication Research Program. And afterwards, we read 2 pages from the Pew Research Center's 2017 study titled Personal Finance Questions Elicit Slightly Different Answers in Phone Surveys Than Online. And interestingly, what they found is that depending on how they conducted surveys with participants, if researchers either called in and sat with them on the phone, or if they just looked for answers over text, what they found was that the kinds of answers that they got for participants were different depending on what form of communication was used. To be more specific, what they found was that that studies conducted via text messaging was actually more accurate than any kind of studies that used telephones, so like calling. And there are a few different reasons as to why they believe this is. One of these is because when they use texting, participants are less likely to straight line, which means that straight lining is when participants don't necessarily think about the answers they're giving to questions, and they just kind of give the same answers repeatedly. So for example, if you have like 4 options to pick from, like A, B, C, or D, it's like a multiple choice thing. Participants might just straight line by picking like B every time or C every time. The idea here is that when participants have to answer questions over a phone call, they're more likely to straight line because there's kind of more pressure on them to answer right away because they're like taking up someone else's time and sitting with them. Whereas when they're responding over text, they're free to kind of go slowly and go at their own pace and think about their answers. It's also seen that participants are less likely to satisfice over text. And what this is when participants are asked to give numbers or percentages as kind of their response to a question, they're less likely to round it off. So, for example, a researcher might ask them a question and expect them to answer it on a scale of 1 to 100. And participants who are satisficing will give answers that are simple numbers like 20 or 50 or 35, like just kind of rounded numbers. But what they saw is that when they were texting with participants, instead they were more likely to give like unique or accurate numbers. And kind of similar to before, I believe that this is because, participants have more time to actually think and respond before like giving their answers, just because there is less of a demand since it's asynchronous communication. And then finally, they also found that participants were less likely to give like socially desirable responses when texting, just because over text there's kind of a less human element, you could say, almost like it's feels more private, it feels more like kind of secretive, less like any kind of response that you give is going to be given to someone else. So generally they felt more confident giving answers to questions that maybe they would technically consider themselves to be judged for if it was like a more of a public response. So things about like how they respond to like maybe people of certain races, or how they respond in just generally like more stressful situations. But just then, when it was in a phone call, they were less likely to give these answers, and they were more likely to respond in ways that they believe the researcher wanted them to respond, just because either they don't want to perceive themselves as being judged by these researchers for giving answers that were maybe less kind of socially normal. That was everything I had for assignment 4, though. I put that all in my discussion post and sent it out. Starting assignment number 5, we were meeting again with our online chat group, but prior to our meet, we had to read 3 articles. The first was by Bogle 2017, titled "It's Been 25 Years Since the First Ever Text Message and the Kids Are Alright." This is an article that talks about some of the research that has been done on people, and just like observation of like how people growing up with text messages have like kind of changed in form or in response to this new form of communication. The second article is called Stromberg's 2014 article, "OMG, Texting Doesn't Actually Hurt Kids' Grammar or Spelling Skills." The meaning of that article is kind of in the name. What they found was that even though we see like unique communication styles come out in texting, it doesn't necessarily represent anything new. We've always seen people kind of communicate in like strange or shorthand ways, and texting doesn't necessarily like introduce any new form for this. It's kind of just different, not necessarily like a worsened issue. And then finally, we read the abstract from Tagliamonte et al.'s 2016 article, "So Sick or So Cool, the Language of Youth on the Internet." And again, this reading kind of just explained how there's no degeneration of grammar in internet language, and that younger people who grow up with like texting or these new kind of more novel forms of communication are using like a more complex set of written registers it talks about, and how there's really kind of a new like internet language that people are using that isn't necessarily worse than the more kind of typical face-to-face language that we use. It's just something that's different. Next, there were a series of 3 articles that we were not all expected to read. Depending on how our last names came alphabetically, we were assigned different articles to read. And for me, I was told to read Kemp's 2010 article, "Texting versus TXTING." It's just texting, but with the E cut out. But it was about reading and writing text messages and linked with other linguistic skills. And what they found was that participants were given different sentences that they had to translate into textese. So, for example, changing the word later into the letter L, then the number 8, and then the letter R, just so like it was like shorthand, even though it still represented the same word later. Then they measured how long it took people to make these new kind of versions of these messages versus how long it took them to make like the normal spelling of the word. And then they had them send these messages to other people, and they measured how long it took these new people to read and understand like the normal type of messages versus the shorthand one. And what they found is that people texting in textese were able to create messages slightly faster. It was faster, but not by a big margin. But that When it came to reading textees, the people who read them struggled a lot with the textees messages. It took them about twice as long to actually read them. So ultimately, in the end, it is less effective to kind of message in textees just because it requires more effort on the reader's end, and it just kind of complicates the process overall. This would suggest that generally in communication, textees is not worth using because it does make things harder for other people. So like when we're emailing people or texting, it's just better to use like basic English or maybe very moderate or like light or well understood textees when we do use it, just because otherwise it gets more complicated. Next up, one of my group mates, Angelica, talked about their article called Text Message in School Literacy. Does texting and knowledge of text abbreviations adversely affect children's literacy attainment? Basically, they sat down, 11 and 12-year-olds, and they had to report texting habits and then translate their regular sentences to text messages, and vice versa. They also had these kids justify why they translated some of their texts the way they did. And basically, the children who used more creative language when they were creating like their kind of text versions scored higher on verbal reasoning tests. And basically, the study helped to kind of show that texting does not harm like literacy abilities because in actuality, people who get more creative with their messaging are showing like higher levels of like kind of understanding of like just text in general and like how like written communication basically. I forgot to mention it, but this was actually comparable to my study. They found a very similar thing in that people who use textees more often or who were more familiar with it had a positive correlation with their linguistic ability. They were typing faster and like displayed fewer errors, but basically just overall their ability to like kind of understand like communication in a written sense was more like I guess greater than those who were kind of less familiar with textees, which again just goes to show that this sort of texting communication, like abbreviating things and breaking things down to simplify them, doesn't necessarily mean that we're becoming like less intelligent when it comes to working linguistically. Finally, we had Lucas, who read the paper The Effect of Text Messaging on 9 and 10-year-old Children's Reading, Spelling, and Phonological Processing Skills. And basically, they worked with kids who were 9 to 10 who never owned a phone. And they randomly selected half of these kids to get a phone and use it for 10 weeks, while the other half kept not using a phone. And basically, they were trying to measure like phonological processing skills and the correlation to phone use. To measure this, they looked at the reading, spelling, and phonological skills before and after this 10-week period. And what they found was that there were no negative effects on the children who use phones. Their phonological skills, other abilities didn't decrease. And what they actually saw was that children who use more like textees or like were kind of breaking down text, as I described earlier, they showed an improvement in their spelling scores. And basically, just the whole point of the study was to show that texting is not correlated with like poor performance in any way. Then finally, we were tasked with coming together as a group and finding sort of a conclusion for all these different studies and kind of what the general takeaway was. And what we decided as a team was that, yeah, like as these studies all showed, there's really no reason to believe that texting will like offend kind of writing ability because it actually seems to sort of benefit it as it gives people like unique new ways to think about like text and messaging others. But that was the end of the group assignment, end of assignment 5. So we all said our goodbyes and we went our separate ways until next week. Going on to the course review for this unit, I filled in the 3 previous units, and moving to section 4, there was a question asking, is the internet making our communication briefer? I answered no, because we talked about how, as communication has been going and kind of changing throughout time, that it's always been pretty brief. People have always been looking for shorthands. And then there was a second question asking, is the internet making our interpersonal communication more informal? I said no to that as well, just because similarly it hasn't changed that much over time. The third question was a little more substantial. It asked to explain what it means that the internet is manifesting our preference for intransient and asynchronous communication. I responded to this by saying that intransient communications can be easily accessed at any time because they kind of leave a trail, things like emails, texts, etc. to prefer asynchronous communication also just generally means that we prefer to be able to leave and respond to messages at our own pace and to not have to necessarily sit down with someone else at the same time and actively engage them. Just because as the internet grows and we gain new, more convenient ways to communicate with people on the internet without actually having to be there with them, people tend to gain more of a preference for these communication models. And then I was asked to list 6 of the guidelines that were given for emailing a professor that we talked about. So I just shared that we should write an informative subject heading. We should write grammatically correctly, like in a way that makes sense, spell correctly, use appropriate capitalization, all that stuff. We should use our professor's last name in our salutations, use paragraph breaks. We shouldn't use emails to just rant or whine or complain about things. They should be kind of more constructive than that. And then we should try to use our university email accounts too as we're communicating with others. That was all for the course review though, and then it was time to go on to the term project instructions. At this point, we finally had to settle on our project that we wanted to do in our medium, and I finally decided that I did want to do a project that spanned kind of the length of the whole course rather than just being something that was a deep dive on one specific subject. So I started kind of keeping my 6-day-a-week diary, and then we also had to settle on our medium, and I decided that a podcast does actually sound like something that was pretty fun, so I figured I'd try it out just because it wasn't really something that I tried before. And I'm glad I did because it's actually been proving to be pretty fun. I've never really worked in a medium like this, and it's been nice to kind of be able to sit down and just talk for a while about old content and sort of refresh it all. But yeah, at this time I made sure to start journaling for the first few units that we'd done so far. And then they also wanted a partial screenshot of the stuff that we've completed so far for this work. So I took that and I stuck it in my post for this assignment, along with my 200 words describing like which project I've chosen to work on and how I want to do it, what medium I want to use, and then what work I've done so far, specifically in this unit to kind of fill in that journal mostly. I figured I'd wait to start the podcast until a little later because I wanted to be able to kind of sit down and record multiple at a time. But I mean, the journaling was something that I could do even daily or just from week to week, whatever was more convenient. So I wasn't too worried about that. I figured I'd start that and kind of set myself up for success there. But otherwise, that was it for Unit 4, Assignment 6. So I made sure to take all that material and submit it.